Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish, and welcome to week 3 for English 122. This will be the lecture video going over our week 3 content and what we will be doing this week and what is due. So if you did not watch last week's video, please do, because it does explain the paper 1 guidelines for our very first essay. I'm not going to go back over those. If you need to see what those are, just go back to the week 2 lecture video and check it out. A few housekeeping things before we dive into our presentation for this week and go over outlines, which is our big assignment this week. The first thing is just to discuss, I've had a few students ask about how I grade the discussion forums and what that grade looks like. So what happens is that your discussion forum is worth 20 points. 10 points of that is for your initial post that you are supposed to do by Friday, and that's the post answering the questions that I present to you all in the discussion forum. A reply to your peers does not count. It needs to be the post that answers those questions. So that post, if you submit it by Friday and answer all of the questions, that is worth 10 of the 20 points. The other 10 points come from your responses to your peers. So you're supposed to respond to 2 peers, so each peer response is worth 5 points each. That would be 10. 10 plus the 10 you get from the discussion forum equals your 20. Now, what I deduct points from are for a few reasons. One, if you do not post your original post by Friday night like you're supposed to, I will still let you post on Saturday or Sunday. That's fine. I'd rather you get some points than none, but you will only get 5 points instead of 10 because it's late. So just kind of keep that in mind. The other things I deduct points on are for grammatical errors or formatting errors, or if your responses are just very, very brief and short, like, good job, or I agree. If that's all you put, I'm going to deduct points. So far, no one's done that, which is awesome. However, there have been some students make just simple grammatical or punctuation errors. Titles of books and movies need to be italicized, which is in that MLA presentation, and so I did deduct a few points from that. If you get an 18 out of 20 or a 19 out of 20, that's still an A for that assignment. That's an A for the discussion post. So if you're getting an 18, 19, or 20 out of 20, I wouldn't worry about it. It's probably just a very simple grammatical error. It's probably no big deal. If you get a 17 out of 20, that probably means that you've had consistently the same grammar errors in all of your posts, and you might just want to send me an email and ask about it, or just look at all your posts and see if maybe there's something that was wrong, like you didn't italicize any of the titles in any of those posts. Maybe that's it. If you get a 16 out of 20 or lower, it probably is related to content. So there's something in the content itself that's not meeting the expectations for that assignment. However, if you get a 17 or higher on the discussion forums each week, you will be fine point-wise, I assure you. As long as you're completing the assignment and doing it on time, you're going to be fine. But if you do have questions, as always, just email me and let me know. But I hope that clears that up. So I'm going to minimize my screen here. And with that being said, I am over here now. What is due this week? Well, if we go up here to course content, I'm recording this Sunday night, so if you've not done the week 2 assignments, please make sure by 11:55 tonight you have them completed. For week 3, you only have 2 assignments, so should be a pretty easy week. One assignment is the discussion forum, and I will open it up over here so we can check it out. And the other assignment is the outline, and the outline is due Sunday. Your discussion forum is due Friday and Sunday, as per the usual. So the discussion forum this week, we're just comparing styles of stories. So there are 2 PDFs. These 2 stories here are actually stories that I read in graduate school. I read both of these novels. They actually made a movie out of one of them in the last year, which is pretty impressive. Beautiful Boy, they just recently made a film out of, which I've not seen the film, and we'll explain why here in a moment. There's Beautiful Boy and Tweak. They both follow the stories of Nick and David Sheff. Nick Sheff wrote Tweak as a memoir describing his stint in rehab following his addiction to methamphetamine and other drugs. And then Beautiful Boy is David Sheff, his father's story, from the perspective of the father dealing with his son's addiction and trying to reconcile, why did this happen to my son? Is it something that I did? And he kind of gives the parent's perspective, whereas Nick gives the addict and child's perspective, although he's a teenager and young adult when he goes through his addiction. They're both very good books. I highly recommend them, especially if you like nonfiction stories about real people struggling with real problems. Tweak and Beautiful Boy are both really good books. They are very, very different. And from these excerpts, you're going to realize that they are completely different in how they use the elements of short story, which is why I picked them. So the excerpts are just very short. The excerpt from Tweak is actually the very first chapter of Tweak. And then the excerpt from Beautiful Boy is kind of in the middle of the novel. The reason why I chose these two excerpts is they're both discussing similar points in time. So the setting of the story is similar. Tweak starts out with Nick explaining about a winter retreat that he goes on with a friend, and them discovering like alcohol in the cabinets and getting drunk. And that's like his first kind of dive into alcoholism, which he also struggles with in terms of his addiction as well. And then Beautiful Boy, there's a part where the father reflects on that same time period at the cabin and the winter lodge, and him not putting two and two together to realize what his son was doing. So I have 2 copies of the PDF here. I've had students in the past complain that they can't open them, so I'm going to open them to show you that they work. So if I click on the Beautiful Boy one here, it takes it a while. It will take, this PDF is a big file, so it will take your computer a while to load. As you can see, my screen is uploading it very slowly. I would recommend opening these on a computer, or if you have a smartphone, it may be able to open it as well. Some smartphones do not have PDF readers, which can be problematic, so that might be your problem. You might have to go to a computer to open it up and print it out, or at least to open it up to read it. So as you can see here, it is taking it a little while to load. I've put 2 versions up here hoping that one works quicker for you than the other, but I'm just opening up the first one here to give you an idea. And the quality of the scan, you'll have to forgive me because the scans are not the most impressive quality, but they are serviceable. You should be able to read the file without problem. Okay, so here we go. Yeah, so the Beautiful Boy one starts actually on page 51 of the book, but I would start right here where it says nowadays. I would start with the nowadays. That's where he kind of goes into, you know, his experience with what he thought addiction was, and then he kind of breaks it down more on how he thought it affects his son. So you can see here it kind of goes over to this 2-page format, and then it kind of discusses the point, and then that's the end. It's a pretty short excerpt. It's not hard to get through at all, but it just kind of delves the end of that chapter there. Whereas Beautiful Boy, go back up here, Tweak rather, if I click on Tweak, then it's going to go open up. You'll definitely notice there's a stylistic difference. I'm not going to talk anymore about the elements of fiction with these, or with short stories with these 2 excerpts, because that's kind of the questions for this week. What is different? What is similar? They're very, very interesting. When I was in graduate school, we split the class in half, and half of us read Tweak first, half of us read Beautiful Boy first, and then we swapped and read the other book, and then at the end we talked as a class about, the whole idea was about memory and about authenticity and honesty, and we had to decide which author we thought was more authentic and more truthful in their accounts, because they do vary. I read Tweak first, and I believe that Nick's account is more accurate for various reasons. But I will say this, my friends that were parents, or my friends that read David's account first, believe David's was more accurate. So it's a really cool exercise in who you think is more authentic, and how we can talk about the exact same events but from different perspectives and point of view, and that can completely change our perspectives and how we understand those events. So it's really fun. It's interesting. Like I said, I would recommend both stories, but here we go. We'll get Tweak pulled up here just so you can see the file. This, like I said, starts the very first chapter and then goes from there. So as you can see, they do take a little while to upload, so just be patient, and they should upload for you. Yeah, so part 1, you can kind of see this is the point here, and then it kind of diverges and splits up. And it's a little bit longer, but it reads a lot faster. Nick's writing flows, I think, a lot more fluid than David's. But yeah, so that's the discussion forum, just to read the 2 excerpts here and then answer the questions by Friday. And then your responses are due Sunday. So now, before we dive into our 2 chapters we're going to talk about this week, let's go over the outline for paper 1. So far, all the paper 1 topics I have looked at will work. And so if I've not given you feedback on paper 1 thesis yet, you should get it by Monday night. You should have confirmation that your paper will work. So with every paper that we do, you're going to do your thesis statement, which is just an idea of what your paper is about. And then the following week, which in this case is week 3, you're going to do an outline of your paper. And there's some guidelines in our resources and handouts that discuss this. So this is a drop box for your outline. The guidelines for our outline is in the week 3 portion of our resources and handouts. So here's our outline. And these guidelines can be used for all 4 of our papers. So I've gone ahead and pulled it up to show you all. So, let me get this in here. So basically, I can understand why some students don't like outlines. When I was in high school, I was not an outline person. I naturally like writing. I'm an English major. I should like writing. So my biggest thing was just to sit down one night, chuck out a 4-page paper in 2 hours and call it good. And I could pull that off in high school. I could make that work. But as I got into college and the deeper I got into my classes in college, the longer the papers got, the more detailed they had to be, and just the more you had to keep track of, and it would become very easy for me to lose my focus. And so I started outlining for my papers, and in all truthfulness, college changed the way I feel about organizing my thoughts in written form. I now definitely use an outline because it's just helpful. It's just the best way I can stay on track with my ideas and not get lost within my paper. And you don't think that you're going to get lost, and then you get into like page 3 and you're like, where was I? What was I talking about? And you kind of like go off on a tangent. So this is a way to kind of bring you back and ground you in your thesis. So also, this outline is a way of preventing the 2 a.m. syndrome, as I call it, which I've seen many students do, where they're like, oh, I'll just get to that paper and write it the day it's due. Don't do that. That's not a good strategy. It will not end well. And so you have that 2 a.m. moment of, oh, I got to write this paper. I guess I'll sit down and do it. Some people work well under stress, but this class, the papers that we do, that is not the strategy to go about it, especially when we get to our last paper. So your outlines, the good news about all of this is that I like a very bare bones skeletal structure outline. And what I mean by that is I don't want any fancy I don't want you to write your whole paper out for this. You do not. That's what your draft's for. This is just a framework to show me your points. And I'm going to have an example below that I show you. So all your paper, and if you've taken speech Principles of Speaking COM 121, you will find this outline looks very similar to that class. You need an attention getter, which basically draws your reader's attention to the topic. If you chose to analyze a short story, this can be a question, a passage from the story that you're referencing. It can be a number of different things. If you're writing your own story for this first paper and choosing the creative writing option, then you have lots of things you can do. You can start with a conversation, you can dive into the setting of the place, you can start with the conflict itself. I mean, you have lots of ways that you can start it out to grab your audience's attention. You need to somehow link to your thesis, which is the topic of the paper. For the creative writing option, you have a lot more freedom with this. You don't have to come out and say, this is a story about redemption. You don't have to do that. You've got a little more freedom. But if you're doing an analysis of a short story, then by the end of your first paragraph, you should outline, say, here's the point that this whole paper is trying to make. I'm going to analyze this story and prove my points via A, B, and C, which I've posted here. So the length of your outline is subject to change. If you're choosing the creative writing option and you have spoilery twists and turns in your story, I don't want you to spoil me. I don't like spoilers. So don't give anything away. You can literally write in your outline, I cannot reveal this information because it's a twist. I'll be like, okay, fair enough. So what I've done here is kind of outlined an example. So this is an example outline. So I've kind of put my little introduction here where I explain just a few things about my topic. And then as you can see, I list my points here with commas in between. And then this is my skeletal framework. So I've got my main points, my history, my development, my standards, and the future. And I've got a few little subpoints throughout here that kind of show what I'm planning to talk about, and that also helps to keep me on track. So as you can see, the intros here, I've got some Roman numerals that list all my points. I've got some subpoints. Each subpoint does not have to be equal. Like this one only has 1 and this one has 3. So it can be varied. And then my conclusion, you'll note, is in development. So if you really don't have a conclusion, you can put in there it's a work in progress and you've not completed much of it. I understand that. My conclusion is always the last thing I write. So at this point, I probably don't have a defined conclusion. That's okay. You can just explain that to me and that's fine. And this is not set in stone. That's what I want to iterate the most and emphasize the most. This outline, I'm not making you sign it away and say this is the outline I must go with. This is just a framework. It is always a work in progress, and you can change this. If your final draft does not follow this exact structure, that's okay. These papers are designed for you to work on them and develop them and change them. My biggest thing is that I want there to be something there that you can start from. Some kind of framework that you can build your paper from so that you're not sitting there on Sunday when it's due going, I don't know where to start. That's what I want to prevent. I want this outline to give you a starting point that you can build from, and if you change it along the way, if you take out subpoints and add in new points and develop it and alter it, that's fine. That's awesome. That shows your paper is growing and changing and getting better. But I just want you to at least give me some kind of framework that I can see, and then that's where the 10 points come from. If you give me some framework I can work with and see, okay? So that's pretty much it. That's the outline. That's all you gotta do is give me like a little preview of your intro, something to tease your audience with, and then just a breakdown, pretty vague breakdown of your points. And then if your conclusion's not done, you can just note that it's in development. And that's it. And if you have questions about it, you can always email me. But I'm not going to deduct points on your outline unless you just don't follow the instructions. Unless it doesn't look anything like this, and then I'll deduct points. But if it looks something in the similar vein to this, you're going to be fine. All right? So, with that being said, that's all the assignments this week for week 3. Just the discussion forum and the outline. So what we're going to finish out with today, and this video should not be as long as last week's. Last week we had a lot to talk about. This week should be fairly shorter. We're just going to talk about chapters 5 and 6. So, go pull them up here. Chapters 5 and 6 talk about point of view and symbolism. Oh my goodness. I moved myself over. So the very first thing on page 179 is looking at point of view, which I like how our chapter here kind of breaks this one apart. It's basically talking about different types of narration. And when you think about it, most stories have some form of a narrator, the one that's observing the events in a story. I think the very first time I noticed a narrator in a story was reading Harry Potter when it first came out in the 90s, if you can believe it came out in the 90s. I remember reading it when I was in school and going, oh, the narrator's telling me okay, there's the narrator. They're present. They're not a person. It's kind of like an omniscient narrator, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But I recognized the narrator was there. And then after that, I started to notice what the narrator was in each of the stories that I read, which is kind of fun. It's kind of neat to see what that perspective is and to point it out. So our book goes over types of narrators. The very first one they talk about is a limited narrator. And this one's pretty common. We only know what the narrator knows. So The Hunger Games is probably the most popular, common modern example of this. Katniss, we follow Katniss Evergreen, or is it Everdeen? We follow Katniss around, and we only find out things as she finds out things. And so we know what she knows. And so it's a very limited scope. She doesn't understand the big picture of what's happening to her and just finds out as the story goes along. That is the exact opposite of the omniscient narrator, which is the all-knowing narrator. They know how everything has already ended. We're just hearing the story over again. So, Harry Potter has an omniscient presence. You kind of get the feeling that they're just retelling the story to us, especially from chapter 1 in The Sorcerer's Stone, where they talk about Harry being found on Privet Drive. It's a Wonderful Life. We start out at the very beginning, the Angels and Clarence, they kind of are just retelling the story of George Bailey. It's a very omniscient narrator presence. Limited and omniscient are probably the two most popular types of narration that we have in modern literature. Intruding narrator, though, has become quite popular in the last 5 to 6 years. And an intruding narrator is essentially a narrator that can actually reach out and not only realizes the audience is there, but comments to that audience. And the most popular example I can think of is Deadpool. Deadpool breaks the fourth wall, as if you study theater, or we'll go over this in drama, they break the fourth wall, which means they connect with the audience. They know the audience is watching them and interacts with them. It's a very nuanced, postmodern kind of out-of-body kind of narration that recognizes itself. Another, if you have kids, or if you watched this when you were a kid, The Emperor's New Groove, Disney movie where Emperor Kuzco gets turned into a llama, that is an intruding narrator, because he starts out the story realizing we are there and talking to us as if we are listening to a story. So that would be an intruding narrator as well. Third person objective is when the narrator is matter of fact. They are removed, emotionless. Think Morgan Freeman in March of the Penguins. Think any National Geographic or Planet Earth documentary. That narrator doesn't have any emotion. They don't have any stake or presence in the actual place the story is taking place in, but they understand what's going on and are just giving us very matter-of-fact, objective details. And then we have two types of personal observer point of views, and then an autobiographical. The first is third-person objective, which we just talked about. The second, though, is first-person autobiographical. This is very confessional, diary-like. The author can put up a persona. You can think of the Diary of Anne Frank. That's a very first-person autobiographical account. And then probably 500 Days of Summer kind of has a first-person autobiographical feel. And then we have first-person observer, where the story happens in real time, and again, we only see what the narrator sees. You may notice that some of these overlap a little bit, and that's true, because limited narrator and first-person observer are very similar. And if you look in our book, they give some examples, and there's a lot of similarities between the two. I would say that the only difference is that in first-person observer, it's present tense, whereas limited perspective can still be in past tense. We just only find out what the narrator finds out as the story goes along. So those are the types of narrators, and in our book on page 179, these types are all broken down with various examples supporting them. On page 182, we dive a little bit deeper into interior monologue. So in an interior monologue, the narration is not linear or logical. It just happens like it happens in the character's mind. Like I said in our last video last week, we'll talk more about this specifically in the drama unit, but page 182 kind of outlines this along with stream of consciousness, which I always think of Alice in Wonderland when I see these terms, because Alice in Wonderland is very stream of conscious, very just kind of random. Everything happens in different orders, then there's no real linear path to the narrator or the narration. Chapter 6 talks about symbolism on page 216. There's a lot of symbolism, and this slide is kind of wordy, so we're going to break it down. Forms of symbolism. So on page 216, they start talking about what symbols are. They are just items that have more than one meaning. So you can see here on the left-hand side, we've got our different types of symbols. So the first symbol is a shared language symbol, and we have our example here. So a shared language symbol is symbols that have a cultural meaning that is exclusive to that culture. So I'm using a pretty broad culture here. I'm going to say Western audiences would understand what a stoplight is. And that seems so weird, right? Because we think to ourselves, when you're driving your car and the light goes from green to yellow to red, we instantly slow down and stop. Well, I mean, you're supposed to slow down and stop. But, right, you don't just, when you see a red light at a stoplight, you don't go, you stop. Is anyone telling you to stop? Does the stoplight itself have words on it? Some might, but not all do, correct? So it's kind of crazy that our brains link this symbolic cultural symbol that red stoplight means we stop our vehicle. I think that's wild. And it's crazy because what if we'd grown up with yellow equaling go or green meaning stop? I mean, it's just crazy how symbols kind of get ingrained into our brain, and you can see like a shape or a color and instantly know what that is. If I gave you a symbol of Twitter, like the little blue tweet, the little blue bird, you'd instantly be like, oh, that's Twitter. Doesn't say it anywhere on it, but we instantly make that connection to that symbol, right? That is a shared language form of symbolism. Personal meaning is exactly the opposite of that, and this is where symbols only mean something to the author. One of my favorite examples of this is Matt Groening, who created the show The Simpsons. He's from Springfield, Illinois, and most of his characters have names after streets in Springfield, Illinois. So Homer Simpson, he's named after Homer Street in Springfield, which is kind of crazy. And several characters in that show have that naming kind of system. That nomenclature. They're named after streets in Springfield, Illinois. Is there any symbolic meaning behind it? Not really. Matt Groening just thought it was something fun and cool to do, and that's why he did it. It was just something that had personal meaning to him. So that's a personal meaning symbol. We have symbols that are rich in associations, meaning they have more than one meaning. This can be things like colors. So, for example, in Eastern Asian cultures, like in Japan, for example, we think of white as purity, or when there's weddings, we think of women wearing white, or, those that are getting married wearing white. Whereas in Eastern cultures, white symbolizes death. So we wouldn't wear white to a funeral in Western cultures, we'd wear black. But in a lot of Eastern cultures, white is symbolic with death and passing. So it's a symbolic item that has multiple meanings across different cultures. So it's very rich in its associations. An ambiguous symbol does not have a direct or clear meaning. So if you've ever watched the show Twin Peaks, it's a trip. So it's a very, very surreal show. I personally like it. I like surreal things, and David Lynch is awesome for me. So he uses a lot of ambiguous symbolism. He never really comes out and directly says what things mean. And I like that in stories because that leaves a lot to the audience's imagination, and we get to kind of fill in the blanks, which is cool because there needs to be some mystery in stories. If every creator just comes out and says what everything means, it kind of takes away from the mysticism of it, the charm of it, the cool factor of it. So in Twin Peaks, David Lynch uses a lot of symbolism with trees, with nature. The story takes place kind of in this rural area, so in this mountainous rural area, so there's a lot of nature involved with the symbolism, and he never really comes out and says what anything means. It's very much left to our own interpretation. And then finally we have our full context symbols, symbols that don't really have a full meaning until the end of the story. So again, the Hunger Games, the idea of the mockingjay bird. It's mentioned throughout the stories, throughout the trilogy of books. It has various symbolic meanings, but you don't really fully get what it represents until that last book, when all the plot points and all the character arcs kind of come together. Then you kind of get the full context of that symbol, which I think is pretty cool. So you can use any type of these symbols in stories of your own, or you may find any types of these symbols in stories that you analyze. Central symbol is the story, the symbol that the story revolves around, and it often becomes the focal point of the story. So there's lots of different ideas and examples you can use for this term. For me, the one that I think stands out the most that's current is Downton Abbey. Downton Abbey, if you've never seen it, it's a show that was on PBS for like 6 or 7 seasons. It basically talked about the early 1900s and upper class British society. So it was all about these hoity-toity British people and their first world problems. And I'm usually not a fan of that sort of storyline because I'm not a big Victorian lit fan, but I really liked it because of how it used symbolism in the story. So the Downton Abbey is the name of the estate, and this house has multiple levels, and each level symbolizes a class structure. So the work, the servants, and the maids all work on the lowest level of the house. And as you go up, the class structure changes, so the class system is different. And the story kind of plays around with how people move within those systems and the relationships they build, the relationships they break. And it's just a very good symbolic central symbol that kind of represents the entire show's theme as well. So I really like it. I think it's a great example of a central symbol. Some other symbolic terminology: naturalism means looking at a story with a raw, unabashed flavor. Jack London, he wrote To Start a Fire and several other stories. He has a very naturalistic take on symbolism. It's all connected to nature. It's connected to man's struggle against nature. It's all very raw, organic symbolism. There's not anything kind of surreal about it. It's all very natural and objective. Social protest is symbolism that has a political or social spin to it. The 2 examples that I have on here are The Grapes of Wrath and The Jungle. Fun fact, if you've ever read The Grapes of Wrath, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. But The Grapes of Wrath was recommended to me by a friend. They're like, oh, you need to read this book. And I kind of like the Great Depression to World War II era stories. I think that that's a fascinating point in history because we were just starting to get industrialized, but we weren't quite where we find ourselves in the 50s and 60s and onward. So I'm really fascinated with that time period. The Grapes of Wrath takes place right around the Great Depression in the late 20s, early 30s, and it follows this family that decides to go Oregon Trail style from the Midwest all the way to California, expecting to find a better job and a better home, and basically they think they're going to escape the Great Depression by going to California. Spoilers! Doesn't quite work out that way. I won't say anything else about the story except it's a very long story, and so I read hundreds and hundreds of pages detailing the trials and tribulations of these very empathetic and poor people. And I got to the very end of the story, and the way the story ends, and if you've read this book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The way this story ends is so bizarre, weird, and out of left field that I literally chucked my book across the room when I got done reading it. I've never done that before, but I threw my book across the room. I was so mad at it. And I'm still mad at that ending because I'm not going to say anything else other than that the questions are left unanswered. And it is a bizarre ending. But I guess it's effective because it made me think about the social situation, which is what the author wanted me to do, and I'm still talking to you all about it. So apparently their end was achieved. It was effective. The Jungle is also a really good text as well. It's by Upton Sinclair. I highly recommend it. It's basically about the Industrial Revolution in the early 1920s and 1910s and about the very poor working standards in Chicago in some factories at that time. And the book was so influential that the President of the United States at the time actually read The Jungle and was so moved by Upton Sinclair's work that he actually got legislation passed to help these industrial workers have a better life for themselves. Which is crazy that a textbook caused a revolutionary legislation change. I mean, to think about that happening in modern day is pretty crazy. But that's just an example of social protest. So that's our chapter on symbolism and point of view. A really great set of chapters. If you've not looked at the terminology in our textbook or you've not examined the examples that these chapters give us this week, I would highly encourage you to do so because it's really great. So that's it. Your outline's due this week, the discussion forum. Next week we will finish up, if you can believe it, our discussion of the elements of short story in more detail, and we'll talk a little bit more about paper 1. So if you have any questions, as always, email me, let me know. But otherwise, I hope you all have a great week, and I'll talk to you all again soon.